was a little over 12 years ago when Katrina hit the Gulf Coast. I know as we watch what is happening in Houston and Louisiana with Harvey and the destruction being wreaked by Irma and continuing to be wreaked by Irma, and knowing that Katia and Jose aren't too far behind, it's difficult to think about Katrina. And I have to admit, sometimes it seems like it was a lifetime ago. But sometime after Katrina, my pastor, Tim Patterson, got this crazy idea that he should do something to help the people Katrina impacted. So he met with the other pastors in the community. They decided to work together to send a team to the Gulf Coast to help in the recovery. So announcements were made at the local churches, and in the spring of 2006, 10 individuals stepped forward to commit to do what was necessary, without really even knowing what that was, to make a trip down south in January of 2007. The process included steps each of us took on our own: background checks, physicals, tetanus shots. We all had to fill out numerous forms, including the infamous purple paper, which was the document that was colored purple where we promised we wouldn't say certain things or do certain things. That, like when you hit your thumb with the hammer, we'd yell, "Purple paper." We each contributed 10% of the expected cost of the trip, our own cost of the trip, into a kitty, and then agreed to work together to raise the balance of the funds in common, not each of us having our own account that we contributed to. We met once a month, followed a pretty standard agenda: prayer, updates on paperwork, fundraising, travel arrangements, what to bring, other things that may came up, and a closing prayer. We worked together to raise the funds we needed, whether through fundraisers or selling stock in our team to our congregations. The departure day came, and after the van and the trailer were picked up and brought to the church and loaded, we gathered for prayer. Our hands were anointed to remind us that even though we were doing physical labor, that physical labor was an offering to God, the God who had called each one of us to this mission. So over the next 2 days, we rode in a van and broke bread together. We arrived in Gulfport Saturday evening and gathered for worship Sunday morning with our hosts at the Gateway United Methodist Church. Monday, the work began, and by the time this picture was taken on Wednesday of that week, these 10 people had gone from being 10 individuals to a community. So over the next several weeks, we're going to be journeying through the book of Exodus. Now we start today with the first 14 verses of the 12th chapter, the first part, if you will, of the Passover narrative. The Israelites have been in Egypt for over 400 years, and their situation is a lot different than it was when Joseph was living at the end of Genesis that we read about a few weeks ago. Remember, when Joseph was alive, Joseph was the person that got Egypt through the famine. Pharaoh told Joseph to invite Jacob and Joseph's brothers to live in the best land of Egypt. That invitation allowed for God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to continue, that the generations would continue and the people would be more than the stars in the sky. Well, time went on, and there's a new Pharaoh, and a new Pharaoh, and a new Pharaoh. And these new Pharaohs, they don't know Joseph. They have a hard time remembering what Joseph did. All they're seeing is that the Israelites are growing, their population is expanding, and soon there's going to be more Israelites than there are Egyptians, and they could take over. And Pharaoh didn't want that. So Pharaoh devises a scheme to enslave the Israelites. So let's fast forward to chapter 12. Moses and Aaron have been sent by God to Pharaoh. Pharaoh refuses to let the Israelites go. God sets 9 plagues on Egypt, and after each plague, Pharaoh hardened his heart. So now we're at the 10th plague. So God has a sit down with Moses and Aaron. God tells them, okay, whatever calendar you've been using up to this point, scrap it. This is now the first month of the year. And God says, tell the whole congregation of Israel. Now, we all know that word, congregation. We're a congregation, right? So we might miss what just happened there. See, the word in Hebrew is Edah, E-D-A-H, meaning gathering or assembly or congregation. It's significant because it is the first time we see the word in the Hebrew Scriptures. God's telling Moses and Aaron that this people they're acting on behalf of are not just a bunch of individuals, they're an assembly. They're a gathering of people, a congregation, a community. God says on the 10th of the month, take a lamb for each family, for each household. If someone's household's too small for a lamb, link up with another household and divide the lamb so each person gets an equal share. So this meal is not just a family observance, it's a community observance. Everyone will be eating at the same time. Nobody's grabbing a bite early so they can run off and do something. And then God gets particular. The lamb shall be without blemish. Why? Well, I admit, I'm not an expert on lamb, but from the reading I did, it's clear that from a quality of the meat standpoint, whether the lamb is blemished or unblemished doesn't matter. But God's telling the Israelites, it matters to me. I want you to offer me your best. So God tells them to hold on to the lamb for 4 days. You got 4 days to get ready for this, so don't rush. You also have time to get another lamb in case the one you had originally selected is injured. Remember, it's got to be an unblemished lamb. Now, besides 4 days to prepare, the 14th day of the month is also significant because scholars tell us that the way that calendar was set up, the 14th day of the month would be full moon. So God has it arranged so that the entire congregation is gathering in twilight on the day of the full moon when there's the most light to eat the meal and then get ready to head out. After you slaughter the lamb, God tells them, take some of the blood and put it on your doorposts and the lintel of your house. And a few verses later, God explains that the blood is there so that God sees the sign and knows to pass over that house when Egypt is struck. Now think about that for a minute. Let's stop and think. We serve an all-knowing God, right? Everybody agree we serve an all-knowing God? So do we really think God needed the Israelites to paint the blood on the doorposts so God knew not to stop at that house? Or is God saying to the Israelites, if you believe I will do this, show me by painting that blood on your doorpost? We hear that later in 2 Kings, don't we, with Naaman? Naaman goes to Elisha to be healed, and Elisha says, go jump in the Jordan 7 times. God could have healed Naaman without that, but God wanted to see Naaman show his faith. And the same thing with the Israelites. Putting the blood on the lamb of the doorpost is the Israelites' sign to God that they believe that God can do what they're asking God to do. So now, even though these folks take 4 days to prepare this meal, they have to eat it hurriedly. Don't take your shoes off. Don't put your staff down. Make sure you have yourself ready to run as soon as you're finished eating. And if there's anything left over, burn it. You know, this kind of reminds me of Thanksgiving dinners when we used to go to Debbie's sister's house in Connecticut. We'd get there on Tuesday, and the dining room table was already set. Some of the food was already prepared and either in the freezer or the refrigerator, depending on which it needed to be in. Dessert arrived with us in the form of Libby's pies. Oh, Libby's pies. Thank God they're reopening. I might have to go back to Schuylkill County to get a Libby's pie. Which would go in the natural cooler out on the back porch that was screened in. So all this preparation was going on. Wednesday, it usually was my job to make the fruit salad that would take us through the weekend. Then we get to Thanksgiving morning. And the big conversation Thanksgiving morning was, how are we going to fit dinner between the end of the first football game and the beginning of the second football game without losing too much football watching time? I'm seeing laughter, so I'm guessing there's folks out there that can relate, right? But now we come to the difficult part of this text. How do we deal with the part of the story where God strikes down the firstborn of the Egyptians? Some scholars say this is a text of liberation. But how can the slaughter of innocent children be liberating? Remember, we're talking about the same God who asked Jonah if God should not be concerned about Nineveh, despite all the people's wickedness. We're talking about the same God that took human form in the person of Jesus and told an oppressed community to love their enemies and pray for those who persecute them. Is this God really capable of killing innocent children? Now, that's a question we can offer with, but let me offer this. Maybe Old Testament professor Thomas Dozeman is right. Maybe the book of Exodus is not history, but legendary literature designed to highlight God's divine power and divine presence. Maybe it's a story designed to give hope to the exiles in Babylon as they developed the Torah, including this story, hundreds of years after this Exodus took place, whatever that may have actually been. But whether it's historical or whether it's legendary, we can learn a great deal as we continue building community in 2017. Now, the folks who study these sorts of things tell us a community is formed through four things: ritual, learning, service, and worship. Now, God knew that before the scholars figured it out. See, we see it in the instructions God provided in this text. If we read the 14th verse, we see that God tells the Israelites that this is a day of remembrance for them throughout generations. To make sure future generations learn what took place and don't forget as time goes on, every year they shall remember this day. Now, Debbie and I have attended Seders. Has anyone else attended a Seder? They follow the ritual that's described in this text. And the prayers are the same every year, and the youngest child says, why are we, okay. To teach, to remember, and to teach future generations what God did in that Passover. Now, we have our own rituals, don't we? We set up a creche at Christmas time to remind us that Jesus was born in a barn, and the first to visit him were the shepherds, the lowest of the low in the society at the time. On Holy Thursday, we remember the washing of the feet and the institution of the sacrament of communion. On Good Friday, we remember the final walk of Jesus to Calvary. And Easter Sunday, we celebrate the empty tomb. We have our rituals. And those rituals are also a way we teach the next generations about our faith. Those rituals and our Sunday school classes and our Bible studies and our book studies are learning opportunities. As we learn together, we build community together. How many of us are still close to people we went to college with? Bill and Fran aren't here this weekend because Bill and his two frat brothers are watching Penn State yesterday down the shore. So Debbie is not here today because she's with her best friend from childhood at the Jube having breakfast. They could still get together once a year. The next element of community is service. I wonder if we could expand that word to stewardship. For me, there are two aspects of stewardship in this text. Take an unblemished male. God wanted their very best for this meal. They were also told to welcome the family that was too small and to eat the entire lamb. But as they welcomed that family, they were to share with them equally. God allows us to be stewards of our time, talent, and treasure. Are we giving God our best? Are we giving God our best time, our best talent, and our best treasure? What are we offering to those who come in to our community? The Israelites were to remember and celebrate the Passover as a festival to God. Celebrating God is worship. Celebrating God is what we do when we gather here on Sunday, during our individual prayer and devotion time, when we share thoughts on a devotion or reading, and even at the Jube, Mountaintop Lodge, and Dominic's. When I recall the experience as part of that group of 10 individuals who became a community, I see each of the elements I just described: ritual, learning, service, and worship. Those four elements continued to be present as we grew from 10 to 20, and then from 20 to 40. So much of what I described, or what's described in this text, is on the posters in the social hall. Each of the elements is there in one of those posters: ritual, learning, service, and worship. And I wonder, how can our time, our talent, and our treasure help us build the community known as Salem Church? Amen.